Spring, 1943. The desert wind over Tunisia carries the smell of oil, dust, and defeat. What was once Field Marshal Rommel's proud Afrika Korps now lies shattered among the dunes, engines silent, banners lowered, precision swallowed by exhaustion. Under the white heat of a North African sun, the soldiers of the Reich lay down their arms. They had been told this would never happen, that the desert campaign was a proving ground for German destiny. Instead, it has become its grave. Columns of prisoners stretch for miles across the sand. Sunburned, hollow-eyed, their uniforms faded to the color of the earth, they march between American and British guards. The victors offer water, not cruelty, order, not chaos. For men trained to see the enemy as barbaric, it is a confusing mercy. Behind barbed wire, they wait, silent, watchful, disciplined even in defeat. Word spreads through the ranks like wildfire. They're sending us to America. The idea sounds absurd. To most, America exists only as propaganda, a land of chaos, greed, and jazz. No soldier expects to see it, much less as a captive. Yet the rumors persist. The paperwork confirms it. They are catalogued, deloused, photographed. A number replaces a name. Tags are stenciled on their uniforms, property of the U.S. Army. At night, they hear the distant roar of transport planes, the endless rumble of engines preparing to move men and machines across oceans. Even in defeat, they sense the scale of it, the organization, the machinery, the rhythm. Some whisper that Germany has lost to a factory, not an army. Others refuse to believe it. As the convoys form at the docks, thousands of men stand in silence, watching the horizon. The ships that will carry them westward loom against the setting sun, gray silhouettes of a power they have never truly understood. The empire they served has fallen silent behind them. Ahead lies another world, one that fights with machines, not myths. But none of them yet realize that captivity will become their most profound education. The Liberty ships groan under the weight of their cargo, not oil or tanks, but men. Thousands of captured Germans are packed into the steel bellies of vessels built for speed, not comfort. The air below deck is thick with salt and sweat, the slow rhythm of the Atlantic matching the dull pulse of the engines. Guards patrol the narrow gangways with rifles slung loosely across their shoulders. Alert, but never cruel. It is discipline without hatred, control without vengeance. Some prisoners sing to keep their dignity intact. Faded marching songs echo against the metal walls, colliding with the endless hum of machinery. Others stare into the darkness, silent, calculating the distance between pride and survival. Above, officers whisper that America is soft, a land of abundance and indulgence. "They'll treat us like kings," one insists, his voice half mocking, half hopeful. But as the days stretch into weeks, that promise feels hollow. The sea is indifferent, and so are the engines. Each meal is measured, every order precise. Even in transit, the Americans seem incapable of disorder. To the Germans, this mechanical efficiency feels alien, neither born of fear nor fanaticism, but of habit. The convoy moves in perfect formation, shielded by escort ships, fueled by an invisible machine of logistics that never falters. In their narrow bunks, the prisoners begin to sense that they are witnessing something greater than victory. They are witnessing scale. Below deck, the rhythmic pounding of pistons becomes a kind of hymn. It is the sound of an empire that does not call itself one. To the men who once marched under the black cross of the Wehrmacht, it is both terrifying and mesmerizing. Power without spectacle, strength without slogans. At dawn, the gray Atlantic softens into color. A line of light forms on the horizon, and then the faint outline of towers, rising through the mist. New York, The city they had only known from propaganda reels appears before them, immense and unscarred. For the first time, silence replaces arrogance, and beyond that skyline, the lesson awaiting them would prove far more enduring than the war itself. The first sight is a statue, a woman in bronze, torch raised high above the harbor. The men recognize her from photographs, from postcards confiscated years ago by censors, the Statue of Liberty. To them, it is a monument to everything they were told was weak: democracy, individualism, chaos disguised as freedom. Now, as their ships edge toward the docks, she towers above them, calm and unshaken. For men who once marched beneath the swastika, the irony is immense. New York's harbor hums with life. Tugboats weave through the water like insects around a hive. Dock workers in denim and sweat-stained shirts shout orders across the decks, their movements practiced, efficient, fearless. There are no officers barking commands, no salutes, no uniforms. Yet everything functions with mechanical precision. A German officer watches silently, the question escaping his lips before he can stop it. So this is the enemy? The prisoners are herded onto the piers, not with rifles at their backs, but with brisk instructions and clipped gestures. American military police move among them, firm but indifferent. Within hours, trains wait nearby, their carriages labeled and scheduled, ready to distribute thousands across a continent. To the Germans, the speed of it borders on the unbelievable. This, they realize, is not a nation at war for survival. It is a civilization in motion. From the windows of the trains, the prisoners watch the city pass, endless rows of buildings untouched by bombs, factories running at full steam, streets alive with people who do not flinch at the sound of engines. There are no ruins, no ration lines, no fear. Even the air feels different, thick with industry, but free of despair. It is a revelation disguised as a train ride. As the miles unfold, the landscape transforms. Steel and brick give way to farmland, vast plains that stretch beyond imagination. America's size defies comprehension. Every mile of track, every whistle of steam seems to declare a single truth. Power here does not boast, it simply operates. Inside the train cars, conversations fade into silence. The men stare through the glass at a land too rich to fit into the myths they had believed. For the first time, their confidence feels misplaced. They will soon arrive in camps scattered across the American heartland, places of order, not cruelty. There, behind the fences and wheat fields, a deeper lesson will begin. And in that quiet captivity, belief itself will start to change. Across the heartland of America, far from the coasts and cities, the trains come to a stop. The doors slide open to reveal rows of wooden barracks rising from the plains, neat, symmetrical, surrounded by wire. Camps like Fort Robinson in Nebraska, Camp Swift in Texas, and 100 others just like them, each one a mirror of American efficiency, functional, ordered, quietly humane. The prisoners step onto soil that smells of wheat and rain, not smoke or gunpowder. Guards watch from the towers, rifles slung casually, their faces calm. Orders are given in English, short and clear. There are no insults, no beatings. The tone is firm but fair. The Germans expect vengeance yet encounter routine. It is discipline stripped of cruelty, control without hatred, a moral contradiction none of them can easily reconcile. Inside the barracks, they find bunks made with military precision. Canteens serve hot meals at regular hours, meat, milk, white bread. A few men laugh quietly, comparing it to the rations of the Wehrmacht. Even the coffee, thin and sweet, feels like luxury after months of desert warfare. For soldiers raised on hierarchy and deprivation, this abundance is unsettling. The enemy they were told was weak seems instead profoundly capable. Days follow a rhythm. Morning roll call, work assignments, evenings spent reading, writing, or staring at the endless horizon beyond the wire. In the distance, locomotives thunder through the night, their echoes rolling across the plains like the heartbeat of an invisible giant. Every whistle, every metallic hum, is a reminder that this country fights with its factories. Slowly, belief begins to shift. The slogans of superiority they once repeated without question now sound hollow. America, they realize, does not conquer through ideology, but through organization. Its strength lies not in flags or speeches, but in the quiet synchronization of millions of ordinary citizens working toward a single goal. Letters from home tell of bombed cities and hunger, yet here there is order and plenty. The contrast gnaws at them. What they see around them is not decadence, but resilience, an industrial rhythm that never stops, even in peace. Some begin to ask questions instead of offering explanations. They study the machinery that drives the camp, the fairness that governs it, the respect that persists even between enemies. For the first time, curiosity replaces contempt. In the wheat fields of Kansas, the men of the Africa Corps awaken to a truth their commanders never taught them, that power can be silent, that freedom can be disciplined, and that dignity can survive defeat. But soon, as their labor begins, that quiet revelation will deepen into something far more personal, a struggle not against America, but against themselves. Before capture, they had been certain of one thing, that German science and discipline stood unmatched in the world. From childhood, they were taught that their nation had inherited the destiny of modernity, that the Reich was the pinnacle of human order. It was a belief reinforced in every lecture, every poster, every speech. Precision was their birthright, superiority their creed. To doubt it was to betray everything they had fought for. But captivity has a way of stripping illusions bare. Behind the wire, the world no longer conforms to the stories they were told. Beyond the fences stretch towns alive with motion, tractors cutting through endless fields, trucks rattling down dirt roads, silos gleaming under the sun. None of it feels decadent, none of it feels disorganized. To men who once saw America as a land of chaos, this calm abundance feels almost unnatural. A young guard, no older than 20, tells a prisoner that his father works at a factory in Detroit, producing one bomber every day. The Germans exchange skeptical glances. One plane a day? Impossible. In the Reich, such production would take weeks, perhaps months. Yet later, as they overhear news of thousands of Allied aircraft filling the skies over Europe, the lie begins to sound less like fantasy and more like arithmetic. Inside the camp, pride clings on in familiar forms. Officers organize lectures to preserve morale. Maps are drawn, strategies debated, history reinterpreted. They tell their men that Germany's culture, its poets, its scientists, its sense of destiny, will endure even if the war is lost. The Americans build machines, one officer declares, but we build civilization. The others nod, though fewer believe it each day. Outside, America continues to move with quiet purpose. The prisoners see women driving tractors, children delivering newspapers, men in overalls working 12-hour shifts. Not out of fear, but conviction. There are no slogans here, no rallies, no portraits of leaders. Only the rhythm of a people who trust in process more than perfection. To the men of the Africa Corps, that rhythm feels both alien and irresistible. The myth of superiority begins to weaken, not in argument, but in observation. Every truck that passes, every train whistle that echoes across the plains, chips away at what once seemed unshakable. They begin to see that power can be humble, that strength can wear a worker's gloves. In the evenings, when the camp quiets and the last light fades beyond the barbed wire, some men still speak of the Reich as if it might return. Others remain silent, their thoughts turning inward toward doubts too dangerous to share. What they cannot yet admit, even to themselves, is that the world they believed in may already be gone, and soon, through the labor that awaits them, they will confront the full measure of that loss. The war has carried them across an ocean, and now it brings them to the fields. Under the rules of the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war may labor, not as slaves, but as workers. Across the United States, thousands of Germans are assigned to farms, sawmills, and canneries. From the Texas plains to the forests of Wisconsin, they are folded quietly into the machinery of the American home front. At dawn, trucks arrive at the camp gates. The prisoners climb aboard, their uniforms faded, their boots caked with dust. The guards ride alongside them, rifles resting idly on their knees. There is no tension, only routine. By mid-morning, they step into landscapes so vast they seem endless, fields of wheat that shimmer under the sun, orchards heavy with fruit, barns humming with the sound of work. The Germans are astonished by what they see. Tractors roar from sunrise to dusk, operated by men too old for war and women in overalls who drive them with quiet confidence. Conveyor belts, irrigation lines, and grain silos all move with the rhythm of a single mind, a civilian army of labor, organized and tireless. To soldiers raised in a hierarchy of command, it feels impossible. No officers shout, no fear drives obedience, and yet everything functions. At first, many refuse to believe it. They work because they must, keeping their distance from the Americans who supervise them. Yet the atmosphere is not one of hostility. The farmers treat them not as enemies, but as hands needed for the harvest. One afternoon, after a long day in the heat, a farmer removes his hat and says simply, "Good work, boys." The words land heavier than any punishment. To be thanked, sincerely, without condescension, unsettles them in ways no propaganda ever could. In the evenings, they are driven back to camp. The air cools. Beyond the barbed wire, they hear the sounds of rural life, dogs barking, the clatter of dinner plates, the laughter of children playing in the distance. For men who once marched through conquered cities, it is an entirely different kind of power. Peace without fear, order without violence. Some begin to write home, though their letters are censored. One man dares to include a single line. "The Americans are not what we were told." Another sketches a drawing of a combine harvester and labels it simply efficiency. But not all yield so easily. Others cling to pride as if it were armor. They refuse to learn English. They turn away when Americans speak to them. In the barracks, they remind each other that this is only a pause, not an end. Yet even defiance begins to erode under the steady rhythm of work. Days pass into weeks, and the unfamiliar becomes ordinary. The soil stains their hands. The food, once strange, becomes familiar. Work, at first a humiliation, turns into something closer to participation, a quiet acknowledgement of a world that functions without ideology. They begin to see that power can be simple and strength can be kind. When night falls, the prisoners lie awake, listening to the distant trains that carry grain, coal, and steel toward unseen cities. The sound is steady, patient, unstoppable, the heartbeat of an industrial democracy at war. And in that sound, many hear a truth they can no longer deny. The struggle that began as resistance is becoming revelation. And soon, among the machines themselves, that revelation will find its fullest form. By late 1944, the rhythm of captivity has become routine. The men rise with the dawn, march to their labor sites, and return each evening beneath a sky too wide to feel like prison. Yet among them are minds that cannot stop analyzing. Engineers, mechanics, draftsmen, men trained to measure the world by precision and hierarchy. When American supervisors ask for help repairing farm machinery, curiosity overtakes pride. The Germans volunteer, half from boredom, half from disbelief. They expect complexity. What they find instead is simplicity refined to genius. The tractors, plows, and harvesters they inspect are not crafted with the meticulous artistry of German design. Their welds are rough, their bolts exposed, their paint uneven. One Luftwaffe mechanic peers into an engine and mutters, "Crude, but it works forever." Around him, the others nod. For the first time, they see a kind of engineering that does not worship perfection, but permanence. Here, machines are not built to impress. They are built to endure. Each part can be replaced, each system understood by any worker, not just an expert. Spare parts arrive by the truckload. Nothing is scarce, nothing sacred. A broken gear is not a failure. It is an expected stage in a process designed to continue without pause. This philosophy shocks them more than any weapon ever could. They begin to see the invisible force behind American power: adaptability. Where Germany worshipped precision, America mastered repetition. In Detroit, assembly lines built bombers faster than German engineers could design them. On these farms, the same principle thrives in miniature. The entire nation seems wired to the same rhythm, not elegance, but efficiency. The Germans talk quietly among themselves. "In Germany, we build one perfect engine," says a captured engineer. "Here they build 1,000 that run just as well." He means it as criticism, but the words linger like prophecy. The prisoners had once believed that excellence belonged to the few. Now they witness a culture where competence belongs to everyone. Days pass, and they begin to assist with small repairs, sharpening blades, tuning belts, adjusting engines. They work beside American farmers who treat them not as inferiors, but as colleagues. It is a strange equality that disarms them more than barbed wire ever could. No officer commands. No overseer threatens. The work moves forward simply because everyone believes it should. The irony deepens with every turn of the wrench. These men, who fought for a master race, now labor in a democracy that treats its workers as partners in victory. They had been told that hierarchy was civilization, that only command could create progress. But in these fields, progress grows from cooperation. The lesson is humbling, and in its quiet way, transformative. One evening, as the sun sets over rows of harvested grain, a mechanic watches a convoy of trucks rumble past the horizon, engines roaring in sync like an industrial symphony. "Every man builds," he says softly, "and that is their secret." Around him, no one disagrees. The myth of superiority, once rooted in their bones, begins to erode under the steady hum of machinery built by millions of ordinary hands. In time, some of the engineers are transferred to workshops or maintenance sheds within the camps. There they teach others what they have learned, repairing the very tools of the nation that defeated them. Yet the work no longer feels like humiliation. It feels like understanding. They begin to admire what they once despised: the democracy of design, the freedom of imperfection. The moral inversion is complete. They had fought for an empire that claimed to be eternal, and now they labor for a system that survives precisely because it can change. America's machines are not monuments. They are continuations. Every bolt, every rivet, every willing pair of hands adds to a structure larger than ideology. As the weeks turn to months, the prisoners no longer see themselves as masters fallen from grace, but as witnesses to a civilization powered not by blood, but by belief. Belief in work, in motion, in shared purpose. And soon, as news from Europe reaches the camps, that belief will collide with the collapsing reality of the world they left behind. By the winter of 1944, the mail begins to arrive, at first in small bundles, carried by military trucks to each camp, then in steady waves, envelopes marked with census stamps, addresses smudged by the long journey across the Atlantic. For months, the prisoners have lived inside an illusion of calm, fields, food, work, and silence. But the letters bring the war back to them, word by word. They read in silence. The paper trembles in their hands. Cities they once called home, Hamburg, Cologne, Berlin, now exist only as memories beneath clouds of ash, entire streets gone. Families scattered, factories reduced to molten steel. The letters speak of ration lines that stretch for hours, of nights spent in cellars, of children who no longer ask when their fathers will return. The sirens never stop, one wife writes. Every sound feels like the next explosion. Inside the barracks, men who once fought side by side now sit apart, absorbed in their own private ruins. Some fold the letters carefully, as if by doing so they could preserve what remains of the world they left behind. Others tear them open again and again, searching for something between the lines, a word of hope, a sign of survival. But hope has become as rare as home itself. Outside the fences, life continues with unnerving normalcy. The prisoners watch American trains thunder past, loaded with wheat, coal, and oil. The rhythm of industry never falters. They see towns where factories run through the night, where store shelves are full, where no one looks afraid. The contrast is unbearable. The men of the Afrika Korps had once sworn to die for the Reich. Now, in captivity, they find themselves envying the very people who defeated them. Around the campfires, the conversations grow quieter, more personal. "We are safer here," one man says, softly. Another nods. It is a truth too heavy to admit, but impossible to deny. Behind the wire, they sleep in beds, eat full meals, and hear music on the radio. In freedom, their families sleep in basements. The irony eats at them. Their capture, once a humiliation, has become salvation. They are prisoners, yet alive. Their families free, yet surrounded by death. For some, this realization breaks something deep inside. For others, it awakens a kind of clarity. Letters move both ways. The prisoners are allowed to write home. Short, censored notes limited to a few lines. Most write the same words. "I am well. I am safe. I hope you are too." But a few dare to say more. One man writes, "We have no shame here, only confusion." Another, "Our enemies have no hatred, only work." The censors let these lines pass, not realizing they carry something dangerous: empathy. In the weeks that follow, the tone of the camp begins to change. Some men volunteer for extra labor, not out of obligation, but from restlessness. They help local farmers fix fences, harvest fields, or mend roofs damaged by storms. A few even learn English to better understand their surroundings. Each act is small, almost invisible. But together, they mark a shift, from resistance to reconciliation. The war no longer feels like a crusade. It feels like a tragedy of belief, a story they no longer wish to tell. In conversations after lights out, they begin to question the doctrines that once filled them with certainty. If Germany's destiny was divine, why is its sky on fire? If its people were chosen, why are they starving? Outside, the night is still. The wheat fields whisper against the wire. Somewhere, a train passes, its whistle long and mournful, carrying more supplies toward a war that now feels distant, abstract, and senseless. Each man sits with his letter folded in his lap, a small bridge between two worlds that no longer resemble each other. They have lost their purpose, but found perspective, and soon, under the quiet guidance of their captors, that perspective will deepen into something even more dangerous: understanding. By 1945, the rhythm of captivity has settled into something deeper than routine. The guards know the prisoners by name, the farmers wave as the trucks pass. The war in Europe still rages, but here, in the American interior, something quieter unfolds: an education without classrooms, an enlightenment behind barbed wire. The U.S. Army, anticipating a post-war world, begins what it calls reorientation. It is not punishment nor propaganda, but persuasion by exposure. American officers organize lectures in the camp halls, lessons on history, economics, philosophy. They screen films about democracy, freedom of speech, and the rebuilding of nations. For the first time, many of the German prisoners hear words like tolerance and individual rights not as political weakness, but as civic strength. At first, the response is predictable: polite dismissal, nervous laughter, silence. Some officers among the prisoners warn their men not to attend, fearing contamination. Others attend out of curiosity, not conviction. But curiosity has a way of disarming pride. As weeks turn into months, the classrooms fill. Even the skeptical come to listen, if only to understand what defeated them. Then the newsreels begin. Flickering black and white images projected onto rough wooden walls. Allied troops entering Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. Liberation scenes. Piles of corpses. Survivors staring blankly at the camera. The prisoners shift uncomfortably in their seats. Some whisper that it is Allied propaganda. Exaggerations, fabrications, deliberate lies. But more reels come, and then more again. The same horror, filmed by too many cameras to dismiss. Silence replaces denial. In the weeks that follow, conversations turn heavy. The men who once spoke proudly of Germany's destiny now lower their voices when they mention the Reich. Some cannot bear to speak at all. The films have stripped them of the last illusion, the belief that they had fought for civilization against chaos. Now the opposite seems true, and yet the Americans do not humiliate them. No lectures of guilt, no forced confessions, only questions. "What will Germany become after this?" asks one instructor. "Who will build it?" The answers come slowly, uncertainly, from the very men who once believed in conquest. Outside the classroom, the transformation continues in quieter ways. Some prisoners begin reading American newspapers left behind by guards or delivered by the Red Cross. The pages are filled with political argument, senators criticizing the president, journalists questioning military policy, ordinary citizens debating the war. To men raised in a culture where dissent was treason, the openness is astonishing. Here, disagreement does not destroy unity, it sustains it. They begin to see that democracy's true power is not in uniformity, but in its capacity to endure conflict without collapse. What once seemed like weakness, debate, disorder, contradiction, now looks like strength. Freedom, they realize, is not chaos. It is coordination without coercion. A few prisoners volunteer to teach English or German literacy classes to others. They share ideas instead of orders, collaborate instead of command. It feels unfamiliar, but freeing. For the first time, they experience equality not as a political slogan, but as a lived condition. In the camp library, books circulate endlessly. Volumes of Steinbeck, Emerson, Lincoln's speeches. One passage becomes a favorite among them, underlined in pencil: "Those who deny freedom to others deserve it not for themselves." The line echoes across the barracks, whispered between bunks at night. carried quietly into memory. Over time, respect replaces resentment. Not submission, never that, but an understanding born of contrast. They see that a society capable of abundance can also be capable of restraint, that moral strength and material power can coexist, and, in America's case, depend upon one another. The prisoners who once marched beneath banners of destiny now work side by side, learning the rhythm of cooperation. Their lessons come not from textbooks, but from observation, how their guards treat them, how a free press functions, how a democracy feeds its citizens even in war. In the stillness of their captivity, they begin to grasp what no ideology ever taught them, that greatness lies not in control, but in conscience. And soon, as the guns in Europe fall silent, they will face a final reckoning, not with the enemy, but with themselves. May 8, 1945. The war that consumed the world finally stops. News of Germany's surrender spreads through the American camps, not with cheers, but with stillness. A few men murmur the word capitulation, as though testing its weight. Others sit in silence, staring at the dust beneath their boots. For years they had fought in the name of a nation that promised eternity. Now it is gone, erased in a single broadcast. At dawn, the prisoners assemble for roll call as they always have. The guards count them with the same precision, the same routine. Yet the atmosphere is different, fragile, as if even the air recognizes what has changed. The men stand not as soldiers, but as stateless beings. Behind the wire, there is order. Beyond it, nothing remains. Some weep quietly, unashamed. Others lift their eyes toward the horizon, where the plains meet the sky. The sun rises on a world that no longer includes the Reich. For the first time, the silence feels heavier than the war itself. Their cause, their belief, their homeland, all have dissolved into memory. In the mess halls, meals are served as usual: bread, coffee, and soup. The guards make no speeches. There is no gloating, no punishment. A few offer condolences. "I'm sorry for your country." The words sound strange coming from the victors, yet genuine. It is an act of grace the prisoners can neither understand nor return. The next day, the Americans lower their flags to half-staff, honoring both victory and the dead. Some prisoners watch in confusion. They had been taught that enemies rejoiced in domination, that defeat meant humiliation. But here, compassion accompanies triumph. It is the final, undeniable proof that the war they fought was not only lost, it was misguided. Letters from home begin to arrive, stained with exhaustion and grief. Entire cities reduced to rubble. Families displaced, children hungry, wives writing by candlelight in ruins. One prisoner reads aloud, "Our house is gone." The street no longer exists. No one speaks afterward. The words hang in the air like smoke. In their replies, the tone has changed. Gone are the bravado and defiance of earlier years. Now, the letters are quiet, reflective. "We are safe here," one writes, "but there is nothing left to return to." Another, more direct, "They built victory from factories, not fear." The realization carries a sting deeper than defeat, admiration mixed with shame. The prisoners begin to see that the true weapon of democracy was not its armies, but its organization. America had conquered not through ideology, but through competence. The factories, the railways, the endless production lines, all parts of a system that valued cooperation over command. The Germans had built a war of belief. The Americans had built a war of capacity, and capacity had won. In the evenings, the men gather outside the barracks, watching the horizon. Fireflies move through the wheat fields. Somewhere in the distance, a train rumbles toward the east, carrying goods instead of soldiers. The contrast is almost unbearable. They had lived for destruction, their captors live for creation. Some begin to speak of the future, not with hope, not yet, but with the cautious understanding that there must be one. Engineers sketch factories on scraps of paper. Farmers study American irrigation methods. Teachers translate pamphlets about democracy into German. The seeds of reconstruction are already being planted, quietly, behind the wire. The war that began with faith in superiority has ended with the discovery of humility. The men who once marched in step to a single ideology now stand scattered across a foreign land, learning slowly what endurance really means. When the camp lights dim, the guards make their rounds. Beyond the fences, the night hums with the sound of machines, the same engines that powered America's victory, still turning, still building. The prisoners listen in silence, as if hearing a language they finally understand. Their war is over, but the lesson, the one written not in blood, but in balance, has only begun. And soon, when the order comes to return them home, they will carry that lesson with them across the ocean. Between 1946 and 1947, the process begins. After years behind barbed wire, German prisoners of war are repatriated, not as conquering soldiers, but as quiet men returning to a homeland they barely recognize. The journey back follows the same routes that once carried them into captivity. Trucks to the rail lines, trains to the ports, ships across the Atlantic. Yet the mood could not be more different. Then, they had crossed the ocean in disbelief, and now they cross it in reflection. In New York Harbor, the same skyline that once filled them with awe now recedes into mist. For many, it feels like leaving behind a mirror, a nation that revealed what their own had failed to become. They stand on the decks of Liberty ships, gazing silently toward the horizon. Some clutch small notebooks filled with sketches of machines and work methods. Others carry only memories, the sound of the American trains, the kindness of a farmer's family, the steady rhythm of a country that built rather than burned. Their arrival in Europe is like awakening from a dream into ruins. The ports of Le Havre and Cherbourg are half destroyed, the air heavy with dust and smoke. From there they travel east by train through a continent hollowed by war. The landscape itself seems wounded, fields littered with wreckage, villages reduced to stone. When they finally reach Germany, the silence is almost unbearable. Cities once synonymous with culture and precision, Hamburg, Frankfurt, Dresden, now lie in skeletal remains. Streets are unrecognizable, buildings gutted, bridges twisted into the rivers below. Children play in the rubble. Women queue for bread that barely arrives. There is no cheering for their return, no banners, no sense of triumph. They are met only by fatigue, the quiet exhaustion of a nation too broken to greet them. For those who still wear their uniforms, the shame is heavy. Former officers now take work as day laborers, engineers, teachers, mechanics, anything that can rebuild what was lost. They no longer speak of destiny. They speak of function, of systems, of rebuilding. In small workshops and provisional offices, ideas take shape. How to make tools cheaper, how to organize factories more efficiently, how to rebuild cities not from pride, but from practicality. The lessons of captivity follow them like invisible companions. They remember the endless American fields, the machinery that never stopped, the discipline without cruelty. They recall how democracy functioned not through orders, but through participation. It is not a conscious imitation, at least not at first, more an instinctive adoption of what worked. Efficiency replaces ideology. Productivity replaces propaganda. Some speak of it openly. You cannot imagine America, they tell their friends, their families, their apprentices. They build everything together. No one waits for permission. Their words spread quietly, from workshops to universities, from engineers to administrators. They are not advocating imitation, but transformation, a morale as much as an industrial shift. Within a few years, the same men who once built tanks begin designing factory equipment, automobiles, and power tools. Their understanding of organization, born in captivity, becomes the foundation of West Germany's recovery. Without speeches or fanfare, they help construct what will later be called the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, and at its core lies the lesson learned across the ocean, that progress depends not on purity, but on collaboration. Across post-war Germany, new phrases begin to circulate. Ordnung durch Arbeit, order through work, Vertrauen durch Leistung, trust through performance. These are not slogans of domination, but of reconstruction. The arrogance of superiority has been replaced by the discipline of production. As factories reopen and towns rebuild, a quiet transformation takes root, one not decreed by leaders, but cultivated by memory. In every assembly line and every rebuilt bridge lies a fragment of what these men witnessed in America. Precision without pride, power without cruelty, freedom married to structure. The empire they once served had fallen in flames. The nation they rebuild will rise from efficiency, humility, and shared purpose. And soon, from these survivors of defeat, a generation of builders will emerge, men who turn memory into motion and captivity into creation. The 1950s dawned over a Germany unrecognizable from the one that had fallen a decade earlier. The ruins were clearing, the smoke had lifted, and in its place rose cranes, girders, and glass. Factories hummed again, not with the rhythm of conquest, but of creation. And among those who now designed, repaired, and built were men who had once stared through barbed wire across American wheat fields. They had returned home quietly, blending into a nation that no longer glorified its soldiers. Yet within them, something of America remained. Not its politics, but its philosophy of motion. They had seen how a society could build unity from diversity, strength from simplicity, power from cooperation. In workshops, universities, and government offices, these men began to shape a new kind of Germany, not ideological, but industrial, not perfect, but practical. Across the Ruhr and Rhineland, new factories rose from the rubble. Former POW engineers drew up blueprints that favored mass production over meticulous artistry. Machines were built to be adaptable, efficient, replaceable, concepts once dismissed as crude. The ideal of good enough had replaced the obsession with flawless. Perfection, they now understood, had destroyed their old world. Efficiency would rebuild the new. In countless interviews and memoirs, former captives spoke of their transformation. In America, one engineer recalled, we learned that strength is not born from fear, but from function. Another wrote, they defeated us not with hatred, but with organization. These were not words of bitterness, but of revelation. The lessons of captivity had become blueprints for recovery. By the mid-1950s, the world began to take notice. Economists called it das Wirtschaftswunder, the German economic miracle. Factories produced cars, tools, and appliances at a pace once unimaginable. Streets buzzed with the sound of rebuilding. Families that had known only scarcity began to taste stability. And while history credited the Marshall Plan and policy reform, those who lived it knew another truth. The miracle had roots in memory, in the quiet education of men who had once labored for their enemies. The American model they had studied in silence now echoed through German industry. Flat hierarchies replaced rigid ranks. Collaboration replaced command. The factory floor became a symbol of national renewal, a democratic machine where every worker mattered. The transformation was not ideological, it was moral. These men had witnessed a system where dignity and productivity were not opposites, but allies. In universities, former officers turned professors taught engineering students about lean production and process optimization, often without mentioning where the ideas came from. In the countryside, ex-prisoners ran cooperatives modeled on the efficiency of American farms. Even the architecture of post-war Germany, modular, scalable, purposeful, bore the faint fingerprint of what they had once seen across the Atlantic. For many, captivity had been a crucible of humility. What began as humiliation ended as education. Behind the wire, they had learned that the true measure of a civilization was not its monuments or armies, but its ability to build systems that served people rather than enslaved them. This new Germany was not free of its past. No nation ever is. But it had learned something profound, that order without compassion is fragile, and that discipline, divorced from humanity, collapses under its own weight. The factories of the 1950s were filled with men who no longer worshipped hierarchy. They worked with purpose, not pride, their strength born not of domination, but of understanding. In this quiet rebirth, America's influence lingered like a ghost, never spoken of directly, yet visible everywhere. The hum of assembly lines in Stuttgart, the precision of logistics in Hamburg, the structure of management in Munich, all carried echoes of a foreign rhythm learned in captivity. The war that had sought to divide the world had, in an irony of history, unified its methods. The enemies of yesterday had become the apprentices of tomorrow, and as the new German Republic found its footing amid prosperity, few remembered the men who had brought home those silent lessons. But they remembered. For them, the war's true victory had never been in destruction. It was in imitation, and through that imitation, the world began to rebuild itself. Decades pass, the barbed wire rusts away, the barracks crumble, and the fields grow quiet again. What were once prison camps are now pastures and schoolyards, their histories buried beneath layers of grass and memory. But across the ocean, in the quiet homes of Germany, memories remain, of wide horizons, of kindness in captivity, of a nation that fought without hate. By the 1970s and 80s, former German prisoners begin to return. They come as old men, carrying canes instead of rifles, arriving not by troopship but by airplane. Some bring their families, others travel alone. The journey is not one of nostalgia, but of closure. They step onto American soil, not as enemies but as guests, drawn by a need to touch the places that once changed them. In Texas, a former POW named Carl stands in the shadow of what used to be Camp Swift. Only the concrete foundations remain. He places his hand against the weathered stone and says softly, "Here, I stopped being blind." A few miles away, farmers still remember the men who helped bring in the harvest during the war. When visitors arrive, they are greeted not with suspicion, but with smiles. In Kansas, former prisoners meet the families who once employed them. Photographs are exchanged, faded letters unfolded. Some of the Americans, now elderly themselves, recall how the Germans had sung in the fields, mended machinery, played soccer with local boys. The men who once stood on opposite sides of barbed wire now share coffee in kitchen tables, lit by afternoon sun. The distance between conqueror and captive has disappeared. Many of the returning veterans bring small gestures of thanks: carved wooden boxes, framed photographs, handwritten notes, a few plant trees on the old campgrounds, markers of peace rooted in soil once used for war. At one former site in Nebraska, a plaque is placed near the entrance. "To the people who showed us humanity when the world had lost it." Their children meet, often for the first time. sons of American farmers and daughters of former prisoners shake hands, speaking a shared language of memory rather than nationality. For them, the war exists only in the stories their parents tell, stories no longer of enemies, but of endurance and grace. Historians call it micro-reconciliation, small, local acts that repair what global politics cannot. But for the people who lived it, it is something simpler, understanding. There are no grand speeches, no ceremonies of forgiveness, only quiet conversations, where men who once fought for Hitler's army admit that captivity taught them more about freedom than war ever did. In these reunions, history's irony reaches its gentlest conclusion. The same system that captured them also educated them. The same guards who once counted their rations now count them as friends. It is not a rewriting of history, but a reconciliation with it, an acknowledgement that morality, too, can survive the battlefield. For many Americans, the return of these men reopens a forgotten chapter. Towns discover that their local heritage includes not just soldiers who went abroad, but soldiers who arrived from across the sea, men who saw America from the inside out and carried its lessons home. What was once a story of victory and defeat becomes a story of exchange. As the last generation of prisoners fades into age, their memories take on the clarity of reflection. In interviews and memoirs, they speak not of suffering, but of discovery. "We learned that strength is not domination," one writes, "but discipline without cruelty." Another adds, "They were our captors, but they taught us what it means to be free." The moral arc of captivity bends slowly, but it bends toward understanding. What began as a collision of armies ends as a meeting of minds. In the long span of history, revenge dissolves, respect endures, and as the wind moves through the wheat fields of Kansas and Nebraska, where fences once cut the earth, it carries with it the quiet echo of those long-ago voices. Because in the end, the most lasting victory was not won on the battlefield, but in the human heart, where enemies became witnesses and witnesses became friends. In the aftermath of war, the world entered a new age, an age of machines, of rebuilding, of reckoning. But beneath the steel and circuitry, a quieter truth emerged. America's industrial might had never been merely mechanical. It was moral. Its strength did not lie only in its production lines, but in the philosophy that guided them, that freedom, when organized, could outproduce tyranny, and that humanity, when unshackled, could outbuild fear. For the German prisoners who had once stared across Kansas wheat fields and factory floors, this realization became a lifelong echo. They had witnessed power expressed without brutality, authority tempered by fairness, and wealth that existed not to dominate, but to sustain. In the symmetry of American machines, they had glimpsed something far greater than engineering. They had seen a society built on trust. When they returned home, they carried that trust with them, not in speeches or manifestos, but in the small practical ways that endure, in the design of an assembly line, the structure of a company, the fairness of a contract. The lessons of captivity became the scaffolding of renewal in and through the post-war decades, as West Germany rose from ruins to prosperity. Those lessons resonated in every hum of industry. What they brought back was not imitation, but understanding. They had learned that efficiency without arrogance was possible, that progress need not demand obedience, and that order, when freely chosen, could be stronger than any imposed by fear. It was an inversion of everything the Reich had taught them. In America, they had seen that democracy could be disciplined, that freedom itself could be engineered. Historians often describe this period as the triumph of industry, but to those who lived it, it felt more like the redemption of it. For centuries, machines had been symbols of dehumanization, of the factory's cold precision. Yet in America's wartime economy, they had seen machines serve people, not the other way around. Each engine, each press, each assembly line had carried a moral rhythm: to build, to sustain, to share. In their memoirs, the former POWs wrote of their astonishment. Not at American weapons, but at American workers. They remembered the calm competence of the guards, the pride of factory laborers, the dignity of the farmer who thanked them for their labor. These images, so ordinary in their time, became sacred in memory. They worked, one wrote, not because they were ordered to, but because they believed in what they built. That single idea reshaped their understanding of strength. Through these men, a kind of moral contagion crossed the Atlantic. Quietly, through engineers, managers, and teachers, the philosophy of practical democracy seeped into the architecture of post-war Europe. The workplace became the new classroom of peace. Factories were reorganized not just for efficiency, but for equity. Collaboration replaced command. A society that had once worshipped perfection now valued participation. It was, in its own way, America's most enduring victory, not of arms, but of example. The United States had proved something the world had doubted: that liberty could be efficient, that openness could be organized, that chaos, when harnessed by principle, could outperform even the most disciplined tyranny. For the former prisoners, this realization lingered long after the camps vanished. In the hum of a lathe, the hiss of a steam pipe, the clatter of a production line, they heard something familiar, the same heartbeat they once heard across the Atlantic. To them, it was no longer the sound of war, but of wisdom. As they grew old, they understood that the true battlefield of the 20th century had not been fought only on the soil of Europe, but in the conscience of man, between control and cooperation, fear and faith, destruction and design. In that struggle, machines became more than tools. They became metaphors. The world had learned that it was possible to build a civilization where morality and machinery could coexist, where progress was not measured in conquest, but in continuity, and in the quiet of their final years. As they listened to the distant hum of industry reborn, many would say the same thing in different words. The sound of those American engines never left us. It was the sound of reason itself, steady, human, and free. In the twilight of their lives, the men who once crossed an ocean in chains begin to write. Their memoirs appear in small print runs, modest volumes, published not for glory, but for memory. The tone is calm, reflective, almost tender. Gone are the defiant words of youth. What remains is gratitude, not for victory or survival, but for understanding. They write of things that once seemed ordinary: the clang of hammers in distant factories, the rhythmic pulse of engines that never slept, the taste of white bread in mess halls, the decency of guards who followed rules without cruelty. They describe the boundless plains of America, fields of wheat stretching toward horizons that seemed to have no end. To them, those fields came to symbolize something larger, a civilization confident enough to feed even its enemies. Many recall how disbelief had slowly given way to awe. They remember the first sight of a liberty ship, the hum of a tractor that worked without rest, the farmer who thanked them for a day's labor. These fragments return not as nostalgia, but as revelation. They had once believed that power required submission, that order required fear. But in America, they had seen a different order, one built on trust, not terror. The older they grow, the more those memories soften into philosophy. One former officer writes, "We thought freedom was chaos. We were wrong. It is a discipline deeper than any we ever knew." Another reflects, "In captivity, I learned that the true strength of a nation lies not in its armies, but in its fairness. They speak not as converts, but as witnesses, men who learned that dignity can survive defeat when humility takes its place. Across Germany, the war fades into history, but its moral aftershocks remain. The world their generation rebuilt now hums with the same kind of energy they once heard across the Atlantic, the quiet power of systems designed for creation, not destruction. The American lesson, as some call it, endures not in politics, but in principles: efficiency without arrogance, wealth without cruelty, freedom without disorder. In their final years, some of these men return once more to the places that reshaped them. They stand at the edges of fields that were once camps, now covered in grass. The barracks are gone, but the wind still carries the faint hum of distant trains and machinery. For a moment, they close their eyes and hear it again, that steady, industrial heartbeat of a country that defeated them without hatred. They understand now that what they witnessed was not merely material power. It was moral architecture, the civilization of freedom. A society strong not because it conquered, but because it endured. The factories and railways they once feared had not been weapons of domination, but instruments of democracy. Each piston, each wheel, each whistle had been part of a larger hymn, that freedom works. In letters written near the end of their lives, they often echo the same thought. The war they fought to dominate had instead taught them respect. The very power they sought to destroy had in the end remade them. History, they realized, is full of ironies, but none so profound as this, that captivity, meant to humble them, had enlightened them instead. Their stories fade quietly into archives and libraries, but their message remains, that strength and compassion need not be opposites, that nations, like men, can learn through mercy. And somewhere, in the long echo of time, the sound of those engines still lingers, the same engines that once carried them into captivity, that fed them, that surrounded them with the ceaseless hum of labor and liberty. For them, it was the sound of America, not a roar of triumph, but a rhythm of endurance. They came as prisoners of war. They left as witnesses of a greater strength.